Thanks, Al, for the invitation to speak here and for everyone for showing up. Um, as Al mentioned, I'll be answering in the negative the question whether the best explanation should also be true. And many writers on scientific explanation have thought that there is a strong link between explanation and truth. And in particular, I think it's very common to find the supposition that the ideal explanation for a given phenomenon, the best possible explanation for it, must have a true exponence. That goes back to at least to Hempel and his DN model, where it was an explicit requirement. But this idea that explanations should ideally at least be true seems to be accepted much more broadly, including by advocates of what is currently the more dominant approach to scientific explanation, namely the causal approach. And it comes up in an especially salient form in discussions of idealization and explanation. Here's Michael Strevens, who discusses idealization and says early on, no causal account of explanation allows non-veridical models to explain. It will be difficult then for the causalist to explain why idealization is so common. So what I want to argue, I think this argument might strike some of you as quite radical. I hope it doesn't strike you as too radical. What I'm going to argue is that this assumption that explanations must be true, and consequently the way in which philosophers like Strevens and others construe questions about the role of idealization and other cases in which there are sort of deviations from the truth. These assumptions and this starting point is unfounded. There's no good reason to suppose, as Strevens puts it, that non-veridical models can't explain. But what I want to emphasize before I get into the details is the form of the argument, and specifically the kind of structure of the dialectic as I'm going to construe it. Usually, as you can see in the quote that I brought from Strevens, people assume that explanations must be true and then try to reconcile that with the presence of idealization, approximation, various deviations from truthfulness. What I want to suggest is that because idealizing explanations and other related practices are very common and very successful in many parts of science, we should basically reverse this, the burden of proof here. We shouldn't accept that explanations must be true unless we have a good argument for that. So with this kind of starting point, I'll look at several arguments that either exist or kind of are possible or come to mind, and I'll cast doubt on whether they actually provide grounds for this, what I'll call the truth requirement. Okay, I'll start, before I do that, I'll say a bit more about this kind of why, because the form of the argument, this kind of structure of the dialectic really affects how I'm going about this. I'll say a bit more about that. Then I'll look at three and a half types of arguments. One that has to do with pragmatic norms. The other is related to scientific realism. And then a kind of suggestion, vaguer, but I think quite important suggestion that without some kind of truth requirement, we're led to relativism about explanation. In the end, assuming I have time, I'll try to give a brief sketch of a view of explanation where truth figures in a different way, where we don't need to assume a requirement of truth from the outset. Okay, because I don't have that much time, and because I'm assuming that at least many people here are familiar with the notion of idealization, I'm not going to get into many examples. I'll assume that at least many of you are familiar with well-known examples that have been discussed in recent philosophy of science. Boyle's law, three-sex biology, explanations with the renormalization group in physics, the Hodgkin-Huxley model. There are many cases in point, the point being that we often find in science cases where the best explanation we have in some cases, the best explanation that seems possible makes assumptions that are known to be false of any system to which the explanation is applied. Now, just to emphasize, I'm not merely pointing to the well-known fact that there are idealized models and they're common. I'm suggesting that at least sometimes idealized explanations are also seen as the best explanations we have, right? It's usually hard to say whether they're the best explanation possible, but that's at least suggested. Cases like Boyle's law are very good examples, because in those cases it's possible to provide a non-idealized model or something close to that. And the reason it's not done, or at least the reason that the Boyle's law the explanation of Boyle's law is used as it's used, is that the model seems, although less accurate with respect to the facts, it supplies a better explanation, more explanatory insight. So for these reasons, my assumption, my starting assumption, is that our views about explanation, well, a starting assumption that I also make in the background is that we should assume our philosophy of explanation should display some good match with practice. And given that extra assumption, I think we should start out not assuming the truth is a requirement on explanation, and then asking whether there are good arguments to the contrary. Okay, two final comments before I get into these arguments. One is that on some views of theory structure, modeling, and so on, the claim that idealizations are false involves something like a category mistake, and in particular views on which models represent indirectly through some sort of mapping or similarity relation between the model and its target. Views like the one that Michael Weisberg has put forward. These kinds of views, strictly speaking, treat models and presumably explanations associated with them as not truth apt per se, and so there's no question of falsity. Instead, idealizations are, I presume, to be understood in terms of a high degree of dissimilarity or a failure of mapping between the model and the target, something like that. Now, I myself, some of you may know this, but I myself don't accept this kind of view, and I've criticized it, but I'm hoping that this can be avoided here, bypassed, because I'm assuming that something similar to the problem of whether false assumptions can explain, or to the question, arises even if you adopt this kind of indirect view of modeling. A final comment is that the overall argument that I'm going to present might seem quite congenial to a form of anti-realism about science, and anti-realism in general usually weakens or even completely breaks the link between explanation and truth. I'll discuss some points connected with realism later, but I want to stress at the outset that this isn't supposed to be a kind of roundabout way of defending anti-realism. And so far as I can tell, pretty much everything I say is supposed to be compatible with both realism and anti-realism, as far as I can tell. Okay, so let's start by just labeling the idea that explanations must be true. The truth requirement, or TR for short, that's on the handout. To be more precise, TR is the claim that the best explanation for a phenomenon has a true explanans. That is, the explanans accurately depicts whatever it is in the world that is responsible for the explanandum. And notice that this way of formulating the truth requirement treats it as an outright claim. That is, it doesn't include an all else equal clause. It says that the best explanation must be true, period. That's the assumption that I think many people have, and that's the assumption I'll criticize. Direct, straightforward argument for this claim was made by David Lewis back in 1986 in his paper Causal Explanation. In that paper, Lewis treats explanations as attempts to convey information about the causal history of an explanandum. And for him, therefore, explanation is a species of factual communication, and as such, it's subject to certain pragmatic norms or maxims sort. One of these constraints or maxims is truthfulness. Um, and so in this kind of view, the Lewis view, let's call it, explanations may have a distinctive subject matter. For Lewis, they must describe the phenomenon's causal basis. But what makes them subject to a truth requirement is that, like any description, they're pragmatically expected to be true. Now, Lewis, it's a quick discussion. It's very rich, but it's quick. It's short, and he doesn't really give a sort of compact formulation of the maxim he has in mind. But it seems to be a principle to the effect that all else equal, any statement of fact, an explanation included, is better insofar as it's truthful. Now, the first thing to say here is that this kind of maxim, if I'm understanding Lewis correctly, includes an all else equal clause. So even if explanations are subject to some kind of truthfulness maxim of the sort that Lewis describes, it's still possible that the best explanation sacrifices truthfulness for other features, unifying power, simplicity, some other explanatory virtue, that sort. To reach what I've labeled TR from the pragmatic maxim that Lewis seems to have in mind, you have to rule out these types of trade-offs. Lewis himself doesn't explicitly mention trade-offs, but he does speak about unification, simplicity, and some other features. And he says in that context, quote, that's also on the handout, he says, philosophers have proposed that good explanations ought to show that the causal processes at work are governed by simple and powerful laws, or that they're not too miscellaneous. I take it by that he has something like unification in mind. And he goes on to consider one or two others. But then he says, I reject these kinds of proposals. I say that a good explanation ought to show none of these things unless they are true. Now, this, or in this bit, Lewis seems to kind of move from the all else equal formulation of a truth requirement to a stronger claim. Basically, he just asserts that if the actual causal basis of the phenomenon is simple and general, etc., then the explanation should say that, and if it isn't, then it shouldn't. But like I said, this is done sort of by assertion. There's no consideration of the possibility of trade-offs, and so I think the idea that we might have good reasons for deviating from truth, good explanatory reasons, isn't considered, and the argument seems to simply ignore that possibility. So in other words, I think a Lewis-style argument, or well, let me say Lewis's argument, maybe a Lewis-style argument could be constructed here, but Lewis's argument, as I've described it, basically just begs the question in favor of the truth requirement. He might be entitled to an all else equal truth requirement, but not to an outright aversion. So my conclusion here is that the appeal to pragmatics, at least this kind of appeal to pragmatics, doesn't give us an argument for an outright truth requirement. Okay, so now let's look at another type of consideration that might provide support for a truth requirement, which is connected with scientific realism. It's usually assumed that realism involves at least a claim about the aims of science. Maybe the best known formulation of this is von Frassen's, who says in The Scientific Image, he says, science aims to give us in its theories a literally true story of what the world is like. This is his formulation of realism. Now, at first glance, you might think that this entails a truth requirement, implies a truth requirement, or at least conflicts with its denial. And then it would seem that a denial of TR conflicts with scientific realism to the extent that you're a friend of scientific realism, you might see that as a problem, but that's too quick, right? Even if von Frassen's type of formulation or his claim about the aim of science is an integral or the sole component of realism, it doesn't follow that truth is an overriding aim, because, of course, this truth might be a goal of science, but there might well be, there likely are other goals. Science aims to predict, aims to classify, aims to do all sorts of things, and these aims are separate and may well come into conflict. Like science, I guess any institution has multiple aims that sometimes conflict with each other. So the kind of von Frosten formulation doesn't in itself favor, I think, anything like a truth requirement. There is, however, in the kind of vicinity, a more interesting argument that it's associated with realism, and that involves inference to the best explanation, IBE. In IBE, one infers from the fact that a given hypothesis provides a better explanation than competing hypotheses to the conclusion that that hypothesis is true. And many philosophers think of IBE as important, maybe even indispensable, maybe even a kind of basic or most basic inductive method in science. And in particular, many view it as basic and vital to scientific realism, because one of the key arguments, or maybe the master argument for scientific realism, the so-called no miracles argument, is a form of IBE. So then you might think that here we have a kind of indirect support for the truth requirement. It may seem, well, in IBE, we make inferences from the fact that an hypothesis provides the best explanation to the conclusion that it's true. And so it follows that IBE presupposes that the best explanation is true. And if the cogency of IBE is indispensable to realism, we can't really deny this kind of truth requirement without giving up on realism. And that would be a very high price to pay, it seems. But this argument doesn't actually work. Maybe it seems attractive, but it isn't actually a good argument, because IBE presupposes from the get-go that explanatory merits are a guide to truth and not the guide to truth. And in particular, if one has other evidence that bears more directly, we might say, on the hypothesis, like observations or experimental evidence, then one should take this evidence into account alongside explanatory merits. It's a kind of application of the total evidence principle, if you will. So just to give a kind of historical example, if we think that the best explanation, this is a kind of ironically presented historical example, but I won't get into the details. Suppose we assume that the best explanation for stomach ulcers is a bacterial infection. It's a very simple hypothesis. It unifies ulcers with a host of other bacterial diseases. It gives you a straightforward mechanism and so on. But suppose also that we have strong countervailing evidence, right? We know that the stomach is very acidic and so it's hostile for bacteria. We know various stuff about the stomach and bacteria. What should we do in such a situation? Well, even though the hypothesis of a bacterial infection is explanatorily superior, let's assume, we shouldn't infer that it's true, or at least we should be careful about that. And that's because we have additional empirical evidence that conflicts with it. Maybe we'll get more evidence that really rebalances the empirical picture, but this is the kind of example where explanatory merits, I think, are are outweighed by other kinds of evidence. Now, all this is especially relevant, I think, in a case where we have idealization or approximation or what have you. I mean, if we know that an assumption we've made is false, we know that no population of organisms is infinite, that the Earth is not a perfect sphere, and so on, then we can obviously safely ignore it when we perform inference to the best explanation. That assumption is, to say the least, very unlikely to be true to begin with, and that counteracts any evidential support provided by its explanatory merits. So, to sum up this discussion of IBE, you can deny the truth requirement, still make use of IBE, So whatever it's importance for realism, there's no argument from IBE to the outright truth requirement that I'm discussing. Okay, a final kind of purported argument, maybe it's not exactly an argument, but more of a kind of a consideration I want to discuss. It's a bit vaguer, but I think it comes from a very important underlying concern, and that's that without a truth requirement or something very much like it, we're led to relativism about explanation. If we don't require that our explanation be true to the facts, the thought here goes, then how are we going to constrain extraneous influences on explanatory judgments? How are we going to avoid situations where deciding which explanations to accept are overly sensitive to contextual, potentially idiosyncratic beliefs, preferences, biases? I think the concern underlying this argument is very important and appropriate because, of course, scientific knowledge is importantly objective. It's not strongly relativized, shouldn't be strongly relativized to idiosyncratic beliefs, tastes, biases, and so on. And if explanatory considerations play an important role in guiding knowledge production, in theory choice, and so on, then they too shouldn't be subject to significant context relativity, at least context relativity of a bad sort. But I don't think this provides us with any grounds to accept a truth requirement because the kind of relativism we ought to be concerned about in this context, this is implicitly there in what I've already said, is an epistemic thesis and not a semantic one. It's a problem about knowledge and justification and how we ought to evaluate and justify explanation. It's not a problem, it's not a question about, per se, about the match of the explanation with the facts. If we want to avoid relativism in this sense, we need epistemic criteria that go beyond particular backgrounds and particular biases and so on. And the truth requirement isn't suited to play this role. You might have false justified beliefs, as epistemologists long ago realized, and you can place a truth requirement on explanation but arrive at a kind of epistemic relativism if your criteria for evaluating explanations allow for a lot of context sensitivity. There are a lot of truths out there and a lot of explanatory connections between truths. So the TR, as I've formulated it above, or really anything like it, I think, isn't necessary, nor is it sufficient as a kind of protection against relativism. Okay. So summing up, I think TR isn't supported by the arguments that I've examined, the argument from pragmatic norms, arguments having to do with realism and considerations or worries about the relativism, the danger of relativism. I'm not aware of any other arguments. So given how I've construed the dialectic, my conclusion is that we shouldn't accept a truth requirement, right? There are no good arguments in favor of it. It's very ubiquitous, it's very common in science to find explanations that don't abide by this requirement. So my conclusion is it's not a genuine requirement. Now, do I have 5 more minutes or so? I'll assume I have
5 more minutes is perfect, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So like I said, I do want to end on a more positive note. So I just want to kind of very briefly sketch a view of explanation that is, I think, well, maybe becoming something of this sort, maybe becoming a bit more mainstream, but it's not the mainstream. But I think that this kind of view that I'll describe allows for objective judgments about explanatory merit, but doesn't require a truth, require that the exponents be true. Just to clarify, I'm not going to argue for this view. That's kind of not, I don't have the time, and that's not the point. The point is just kind of to show you that basically what the price of abandoning the truth requirement is and what it isn't. The view I'll describe really very strongly connects explanation with understanding. Now, the kind of one-liner that explanations aim to provide understanding is almost a truism. But I think that if you don't have a substantive account of understanding, then the truism really doesn't give you a whole lot. And recently, a bunch of people, including Angela, I'll also mention Henk Direct and Daniel Wilkenfeld, to an extent Kate Elgin as well, have provided accounts of understanding. I agree with some of these accounts and have differences with others, but the view I'll describe overlaps to a significant extent with these views. Basically, I think that for a view of understanding to supply a basis for an account of explanation, it should sit well with what we know about explanation on the one hand, it should sit well with what we know about explanation, both from history of philosophical discussions of it, and with what we know about scientific practice. And maybe the key insight in this context is that scientific explanations are closely connected with counterfactual information, including, but maybe not exclusively, causal information. But on the other hand, if what I've said before is correct, the truth requirement isn't a genuine requirement, then understanding isn't likely to be a form of propositional knowledge, because knowledge is factive and it would be very hard to reconcile these two things. So an attractive option, I think, is to think about understanding as a cognitive capacity, a kind of know-how. And more specifically, I'd suggest that we view understanding as the capacity for counterfactual reasoning about targets of explanation, and even more particularly, I'd suggest that we identify understanding with the ability to reach correct answers to questions about what the target of our understanding, how it would behave under various counterfactual conditions. So this is, as I'm sure most of you will see, this is inspired by the work of Jim Woodward to an extent. Woodward calls these kinds of questions, what if things were different questions. You might call the associated inferences, what if things were different inferences, or W inferences. And so the idea is to construe understanding as the capacity to perform W inferences. So I'll just, as I say, there's a lot to say about this kind of view, and I'm still developing some aspects of it. But the thing I want to sort of highlight here is that in many cases, an explanation that faithfully depicts will also be good for understanding. But it's very possible, and in some ways unsurprising, that an explanation might allow for better, more accurate, more general W inferences if it misdescribes its target in some, in strategic ways. If it simplifies it in the right way, if it makes certain aspects salient, if it allows you to unify and generalize over other systems, and so on. So in this kind of view, if you have an explanation that isn't true, if it's simplified, if it idealizes some aspects or so on, the resulting explanation might very well be a better one. Right? There's just no sort of motivation for saying that this explanation should be true. I'll also notice, just before I conclude, that in this kind of proposal, we can perform perfectly objective evaluations of a person's or a community's degree of understanding, basically by assessing how good the W inferences are. That's something we can sort of assess from the outside. It doesn't depend on the subject's point of view or on the sense of understanding or anything of that sort. So in this kind of view, we can have objectively evaluable explanatory judgments that we can sort of make irrespective of subjective or idiosyncratic factors, but it doesn't incorporate anything like a condition like TR that I described above. Maybe we can have a kind of all else equal truth requirement. We can discuss that, but the motivation for, or the kind of role that truth might play in this kind of story would be different to begin with. Thank you.